Hello, and welcome to Beyond the Firewall, the business bytecast, where tech meets business. Get expert insights from real-world business leaders, IT experts, and the latest trends in bite-sized episodes. Stay ahead and explore what's beyond the firewall. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Beyond the Firewall, where today we're bringing in a new vertical and a new topic around mediation. And today we're very privileged to have one of the industry leaders, Ibrahim Hussain, who is currently one of the founders of Sula Solutions. And I want to thank you, Ibrahim, for being part of our podcast. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you so much, Erez, for having me here today. It's lovely to be on this podcast and to be able to share my journey and my work. So I'm a mediator for the Toronto Courthouse for all the civil matters. Also, I do mediations for business owners, entrepreneurs across Canada, across the world. In particular, I work with Muslims from across the world, entrepreneurs, professionals, those who are currently going through shareholder disputes, partnership disputes, or those, for example, who are going through litigation, whatever it may be. Sometimes it's entrepreneurs also separating with their spouses. So I work in this particular area where I deal with commercial disputes with a complex nature, especially, for example, when there's an entrepreneur and you're looking at somebody who's a very high net worth, who has multiple companies. For example, they may be going through a divorce or a separation, and now we have to work towards trying to help this entrepreneur resolve this dispute in a amicable way instead of avoiding the court process, and making it as efficient as possible, and also making sure that they can protect their assets and their companies, and also just really preventing the time strain that litigation has and entails. So that's what I do, and I do work across Canada and across the world. I'm a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. I'm also a panel member of the Vancouver International Arbitration Center.
Sure.
For the mediation panel and for the expedited procedures panel.
That's amazing. And so when a business owner, and I work with a lot of business owners, when they get into some sort of a dispute, be it personal, business, with other clients, you know, where do you see yourself kind of stepping in? Is this before we engage a lawyer? Is there a certain sort of dollar threshold? Like I've been in business now for almost 30 years in my life and never actually worked with one. You know what I mean? A mediator trying to kind of figure things out for me. Like, where do you kind of get real? Where does that sort of not going to my lawyer and coming to a guy like you and fitting in that spectrum? How do you identify that opportunity for a business owner out there who's maybe not aware of how to use you?
So the best advice I would give to business owners is that when you are registering or incorporating your corporation, and everybody has to visit a corporate lawyer, and the corporate lawyer a lot of the times will present the bylaws. A lot of the times we are very quick to just have the company registered. We go through the nuance search. We're excited to have the name. Once we find the name, we're very excited. And a lot of the times, many directors of corporations and founders do not spend a lot of time ensuring that the right protocols and provisions are in place to deal with dispute avoidance and dispute resolution. A lot of the time, sometimes it's just generic clauses and provisions that exist. But the reality is, as a business owner, as an entrepreneur, we need to plan for the worst and hope for the best. Therefore, we need to actually, I would say, craft these provisions. For example, now whenever I'm getting into any agreement whatsoever, even if it's somebody is contracting me to do some work for an international NGO, whatever it may be, I make sure that I craft that dispute resolution clause part of the contract, or at least I review it to make sure that it's compatible with me. Because you, as a business owner, as an entrepreneur, within those provisions, or those set of provisions that come under alternative dispute resolution, you can actually specify there if you want, for example, if you're a Muslim, you want a Muslim mediator. If you're a Christian, you want a Christian mediator. Or if you want a mediator who has experience with tech disputes, for
Right.
and this is where it's really crucial for entrepreneurs to really spend more time reviewing bylaws and reviewing the organizational governance structure to make sure that we are fully aware and we are actually crafting these important provisions. Because remember, at the end of the day, majority of the entrepreneurs who do reach out to me are already in the court process. They have a lawyer. They're trying to get this process resolved now because it's taken too long. However, if they were able to really craft these clauses and these resolutions from the beginning, then they would always be in control, and they would know, for example, even before the dispute has arisen, they would know, well, if this will happen in the future. And a lot of the times when we start a company or a venture, we're optimistic. We think, that everything is going to be rosy and everything's going to be wonderful. We don't think about the consequences. But I believe that as entrepreneurs, we have to plan for the worst, and we have to actually steer our corporations and our ventures in the right direction by making sure that if, for example, there will be turbulence, then we have mechanisms there where we have control over how we will determine a smooth transition through the turbulence.
Right. And is it like a lawyer where you represent both parties, or you act in the middle, trying to go back and forth between both parties to kind of mediate that? Or is there, each party needs to get their own representation? Like I know with lawyers, if you're starting negotiations, it's my lawyer talking to your lawyer, and very rarely do you see a business owner getting involved, or it's usually one lawyer representing both parties, because then there could be a conflict of interest.
So usually, as a mediator, I'm a bridge builder, I'm a neutral. I cannot have any bias whatsoever. And both parties have to agree to appoint me as their mediator. During any moment of the process, if any party feels that, they feel that I'm not neutral, I have any bias whatsoever, or for example, if I see that any bias may arise, I have to declare a conflict of interest, and I can say that I don't want to be mediating such a process. Sometimes it does happen where there's people who I know, and I tell them, look, I can't be the mediator. I know you, and I understand. I may favor you in any way whatsoever, or because I have a relationship with that individual. So majority of the times, it's lawyers are contacting me to recommending me as the mediator, or the parties themselves will reach out to me, and then they will say to their lawyer, well, we want this guy because he understands the complexity within this dispute, especially when it's related to the Muslim community, and there are a lot of faith-based elements as well, where some people a lot of the times they want, not only do they want a legal resolution, but they want a faith-based culturally aligned resolution.
That's really interesting. I never took it in that perspective, because usually when you're talking business, you think in business to business, you're dealing with the court of law or the province or the country in itself, but you're talking about religious based. Is that something becoming more prevalent in multiple cultures, or is this something that is unique in one culture more than others? Like I've never come across that too much from my perspective, right? Like, we service hundreds of businesses out there, and it's never come up in conversation. So can you expand on that a little bit? Because I'm really intrigued.
So the reality is that in the Muslim faith, we've had this process of alternative dispute resolution since the inception of our faith. Our holy prophet, peace be upon him, and his family, was himself a mediator, an arbitrator. He presented these processes, and they are well established and documented in our holy scriptures. And not in addition to the Muslim faith community, if you look at the Christian community, they have peacemaking processes within their places of worship. If you look at the Mennonite community, which is a Christian community, if you ever visit the University of Waterloo, they have the Conrad Grebel College for Peace and Conflict Studies, where I also had the pleasure of studying the advanced conflict management. And then you look at the Jewish community, they have rabbinical arbitration. I'm sure each faith community has their own processes. The indigenous communities have their own methodologies and their cultural processes. So this has always existed. But what typically happens is when business owners and entrepreneurs find themselves entangled in a dispute, the first thing they think about is, because they are obviously position orientated, they find themselves in a concept known as triangulation. Triangulation occurs uh, when we don't when we're not able to engage in healthy disagreements. What happens is we engage in unhealthy disagreements, then that leads to conflict, and that conflict then um, leads to escalation, and that escalated conflict leads to entanglement, and that process, this entire process is called triangulation. So a lot of the times when there's beef happening, and when people are um, suing each other,
Hmm.
um, the emotions are high, they don't want to see each other. And there's a concept of, there's one party, you have the applicant, respondent, or the claimant and the respondent, like we have in the pleadings. So people are positioned, and then everybody wants to obviously retain their advocate, their lawyer, respect and present and argue based on the positions of the parties. Whereas in mediation, we help parties to focus on the interests, on mutual interests. And we practice interest-based mediation. And as mediators, we act as bridge builders. We engage in a process called exploration. And during that process, we are able to guide the parties to identify the common interests that they have, and then we empower them to understand each other, listen to each other, and then they then find ways, and options are then generated, and then they realize, okay, well, this can be resolved. Whereas when litigation is going on, they are focused on their positions. So we deal with these imbalances and all these impasses that do exist. So each faith community do have their processes, but typically what happens, in Canada or across the world, is that the first thing that comes to mind when you have a dispute with someone is the phrase, I'm going to take him to court, I'm going to take her to court. So this statement really has pushed us towards the courthouses. But this is not a conclusive statement. Many people from their respected faith communities, um, especially those who have spent a lot of time prior to registering their corporations, those who have like done a lot of future planning, and those who have then successfully crafted those dispute avoidance mechanisms, they are then able to own the process when a dispute does arise. And this is why um, I think it's vital for entrepreneurs to realize that conflict is not a bad thing. Conflict is going to happen. It's inevitable. We are all going to go through conflict. And conflict is something that we have to embrace. And the best way to embrace conflict is, prior to the conflict occurring, we should think about the conflict. If it were to arise, how would we have a plan in place to be able to resolve this? Just like pilots, pilots always have the plan if things are not going to work out properly. So there needs to be contingency risk assessment. But the most important thing for entrepreneurs is to design processes within their respective organizations and corporations, whereby there can be processes regarding dispute avoidance and conflict management. What's also important is for corporations or entrepreneurs to obtain training in conflict management and dispute avoidance. Also to train their HR staff, even to train their respective leaders in this particular area, just so that when conflict does arise, then everybody has the relevant skills that are needed for them to transition through these challenging periods.
That's amazing, and I appreciate the perspective there because now that you've given me some clarity around that, I think that there's some you know opportunity for me to learn a little bit around understanding other cultures and other perspectives of that. And at the same time, I agree with you around the last statement within respect to training. I think a lot of companies focus on training around the core skills of their daily tasks. If you're a lawyer, you focus on legal. If you're in construction, you're working on whatever it is, or if you're in manufacturing, you learn your trade or your skill to perfect that. But conflict resolution is something that's going to happen. Like, I know that within IT and tech support, when do people typically call is when things are broken, and
Yeah.
usually they're very stressed. And so the most important thing that we actually try to emphasize around our team is around de-escalation, and being able to minimize or reduce the stress on the individual, because we don't know what position that person's in, if their boss is screaming at them why things are broken, or if the client is under pressure because they can't get a proposal out, or there's a deadline, and because something's not working. So dealing with that is actually a skill that I think everybody needs to learn in one way, shape, or another. And I think a lot of companies and business owners perceive that it is a skill that's learned on the job and not in a course or in a material handbook or anything along those lines. And very few business owners, I would say, including myself for many years, uh, really never focused on how to deal with de escalation and how to manage that, and be able to mediate, and help the customer understand that you're on their side and you're trying to do the best for them, but at the same time, you've got to also represent both sides of the party, in the sense that we sell Microsoft and they're not perfect. And at the same time, I'm the person who the customer is talking to. So I can start relating this whole aspect of customer and vendor, and I'm the guy in the middle trying to make everybody happy. So it's a very interesting perspective. And I think businesses out there should consider a mediator a little bit more. And I think not just for your business, I think the industry itself needs a little bit more marketing, because from my perspective, a lot of business owners use that word, I'm taking you to court, or I'll see you in court, or I'm going to sue if you don't do X, Y, and Z. In the meantime, that just opens up thousands upon thousands of dollars in, court actions. And the way lawyers work, they'll send a letter, and then their lawyer sends a letter, and there's 15 letters going back and forth, and you're in for thousands of dollars before you even got into any sort of settlement. So it becomes very expensive to the average person, especially in Canada, where if legal action is required, what options have you explored prior to pursuing legal action? And I think that, the mediator world, and being able to help possibly resolve those options before legal action goes out should be offered. I think almost every law firm should need to almost represent a mediator first and foremost, saying, here's our guy, talk to him first, throw a meeting or session or two, see if they can help resolve it. And if we can't get resolution, then we'll take legal action. But obviously that's less billable hours. But I think from an awareness perspective, I think business owners need to open their eyes on trying to find a mediator within their portfolio, and be able to use them as a first resort instead of a last resort.
Absolutely. Sometimes when mediation may not be the best process for a dispute, there are other processes, hybrid processes such as med-ob, whereby the parties can be part of a proceeding whereby first there's a mediation that takes place. And if the dispute is not resolved within the mediation part of the process, then they would proceed to an arbitration, and the med-ob practitioner would then transition, and he would take off his mediator hat and become the arbitrator. And then there's arbitration. You have for example, the Vancouver International Arbitration Center has a special expedited procedures panel, which I'm very delighted to be a part of. And this is a special panel to deal with disputes, for example, in the couple of $100,000 range, whereby a company can pay about $10,000, and they can have a special expedited procedure and arbitration that will take place to resolve that dispute. We have the Toronto Commercial Arbitration Society. The ICC Canada Arbitration Committee as well does exist. And this again comes back to the point where when entrepreneurs will determine, and when they will take a leadership role in determining what process they want and what process they feel is going to be best for them, they really they can decide from the qualifications of the arbitrator, even to the extent where you could even write, they could even potentially include within the provisions of, or the bylaws of their corporation, that they want an arbitrator or a mediator who comes from a specific background with a certain skill set. If we look at the current field right now, the majority of mediators and arbitrators are legal professionals. But the reality is that although we have lots of disputes, but not every dispute requires that necessarily it be resolved by a lawyer. There are many disputes. There could be tech disputes. For example, it could be like a software company has a dispute. Somebody designed the app, and now there's a dispute with regards to the founder and the co-founder now. Now, yes, if that dispute now was to be attempted to be resolved by, like, let's say, a lawyer or an IP lawyer or a tech lawyer, there would be legal positions. But if that similar dispute was arbitrated or mediated by a tech professional, somebody who's gone through that dispute, who understands the complexity and this, and all the small details that are involved in creating that app and all of these things, then it can still be resolved.
Right.
At the end of the day, the way I look at it, every dispute has a price and every dispute has a value. And the reality is, when you really bring people together, and once people start understanding each other and start respecting each other and they start acknowledging each other, the reality is human beings want to move forward. They want to find peace. They want to prosper. They don't want to remain stagnant. They don't want to, don't want to remain in a dead end. They want to keep moving forward. And especially entrepreneurs, like you mentioned earlier, the phrase, I'm going to take you to court, or we hear also the phrase that I'm going to teach him or her a lesson. The reality is that a lot of startup, founders of startups, or, or entrepreneurs who are, starting businesses, or entrepreneurs who have multiple businesses, they understand that, it's taken them a long time to, generate all this capital and all this income. Sometimes although you can write off legal expenses, but I remember recently I was speaking to an entrepreneur and he was telling me about his dispute. It was a franchise dispute. They had expanded. They're doing terrifically well. And I said to him, look, the amount of money you're going to end up spending in litigation, just because of the malice that you have now. And I said, instead of that, honestly, you could buy yourself a nice car. You could buy yourself a really nice car. You could actually treat yourself. You could use that money, write it off in the right way, expand your business. If you're going to pursue litigation, then it's not going to work. So I said to them, you know what, sit down, talk it out. And it's good to see that, they opted not to, initiate litigation, and they are doing well, and things are looking good, and they're moving forward. There are some scenarios where unfortunately it's very, very difficult to negotiate with people. Some people can be very, very difficult to deal with, and then in those circumstances one has to do whatever you have to do to protect yourself. But the reality is that it all comes back to the point where, if we as leaders and successful business owners and entrepreneurs really work on realizing the importance of planning our future disputes, and if we really realize the importance of dispute avoidance, then we can have everything mapped out very, very clearly, and it can save us a lot of time and money. And most importantly, we can have the peace of mind when the dispute will arise, because definitely disputes will arise. Then we will have a roadmap. We will have internal processes. And you can create internal processes where you can keep these things confidential. Confidentiality is one of the greatest benefits of mediation, my friend, because a lot of the times when things become public and when litigation commences, you're doing your dirty laundry publicly, and everybody can see and read, oh, look what happened.
Right. Right. I
And
hear you.
the haters who have already hated you, for them it's, they get the popcorn, and you know they they get the bottle opener, they open their Coke bottle or whatever they're drinking, and it's like, okay, guys, look,
I love
I
that.
yeah,
That's
this is what
awesome. I love
happens,
the way you just let's get a bag of popcorn and a bottle of Coke and watch the show. Yeah, it's
Oh,
awesome. It's true. It's true. The haters will hate, and then they're just gonna sit back and enjoy the show. So we're a little bit in a tech company here. So I wanted to ask you a couple things around technology before we kind of get to the end of the show here. So you know, how's and again, I'm a little bit twisting it now, a little bit away from the core side of the business here, but can you give me some insights possibly about how technology has made things more interesting in your world? Like, there's a whole bunch of different verticals that were a big buzzword for 2026. I see it for again this year. Two key ones that again I'll put it out there and you can kind of sit down and figure it out. But which way you want to go. One is cybersecurity has been a hot topic and it is going to be a big one again this year. That I already foresee. And then AI is a big one. So I know a lot of lawyers now, they're trying to utilize technology like AI to help them do some of their case building and some of their fact finding. And they still need to verify that, but they're leveraging AI. And then there's a big concern about cybersecurity and breach of data and talking about privacy and all that type of stuff. Where do you see AI as an opportunity and at the same time as a challenge to what you do every day?
so AI is a great asset to use, especially with regards to billing, or it could be just using, when we have to correspond with disputants. It really does make life easier. I remember the days. Remember when it used to take you 1 hour sometimes just to draft an email?
Oh
Now
yeah.
you can get that done very, very quickly. Also, a lot of planning work when, for example, when we are doing work for organizations, for example, designing processes and mechanisms, we can use AI to make things, again, save time. And with regards to cybersecurity, that's a very, very important element within the ADR field, especially nowadays, where even now, for example, I have taken out an insurance, which I am obligated to take out as a mediator for the Ontario Mandatory Mediation Program and as an arbitrator and for our company, where we have to make sure that we are responsible for, especially when we are looking after settlements which are private and confidential, we have to make sure that this is protected. And thereby, even now you look at the insurance policies, and I urge all professionals, ADR professionals, to look through, just like I said, when we don't, even a lot of entrepreneurs, leaders, we don't even look through our bylaws. A lot of the times we skim through our insurance policies. We need to review them. And so many times we all pay, like I remember I was paying a lot of money just this year, talking about tech. I was paying so much money for a lot of my subscriptions, whether it was DocuSign, Zoom, Microsoft, and people don't even realize, but for nonprofits get grants are available for Microsoft. Even Zoom now is offering so many incentives. DocuSign, this year I saved so much money just because I took some time out to review all the softwares and all the things that we were currently using, the tech elements that we were using. And it's important to consult. A lot of the time people think you can just do everything online, ask ChatGPT, but you always need to consult with a tech guy, especially when it comes to a lot of things, because the reality is you have to consult with the professionals. They will give you the right advice. Tech is an essential part of our work now, and it's saving us money, it's saving us time. Most, in fact, all of the mediations that take place for the Ontario Mandatory Mediation Program are done online via Zoom. A lot of the international work, a lot of hearings take place via Zoom. There's a lot of things that come into play there. We have to tell people that remind them about confidentiality. As practitioners, we have to make sure that our servers, everything is secure. We have insurance. Again, we have to read through the insurance policies, make sure that we have the relevant policies and there for cybersecurity and all of these things. And the reality is that tech now is a very important part of our work, and I feel that as professionals we need to constantly be also revisiting our knowledge in these particular areas, and we need to be making sure that we are up to speed with all of these avenues. And again, I think it's important that every company needs to invest in a professional, an IT professional, making sure that they are there when issues do arise, especially nowadays. Even when it could be your website, it could be a lot of things. It's very important to consult with an experienced IT professional. And also I think it's important as well to even ensure that we have the right processes, and our staff understand these processes, and the importance of making sure that we are protecting the data, because again we can open ourselves up to a lot of problems if we do not protect ourselves.
Thank you for that endorsement, even though I wasn't asking for one. But I can't agree with you more. I think between technology over the last couple of years has made things easier, but at the same time more complex because now you're dealing with more variables, right? You've got ChatGPT, you've got Gemini, you've got Copilot, you've got all these services, and you were just mentioning a handful of platforms that you use. How do you know which one's the right one, which is the more secure? Have we secured it to begin with? What is available, what is redundant, because a lot of companies have multiple platforms that do the exact same thing and they end up overpaying, and nobody seems to read all the T's and C's around their cyber insurance. So what ends up happening is we see a lot of times where they're paying into an insurance policy but they don't have all the necessary security measures are in place, and what ends up happening is if there's a claim, the insurance company is going to go, well, when was the last time you verified a backup? Or really, when was the last time your antivirus was running? Because it doesn't make any sense why you got compromised. And the next thing you know, they're doing an investigation and you didn't have all of the things that you told them you had in place was in place, and therefore they have the option to deny your claim. And so these are all variables that I think all businesses should take a process at least once a year prior to your insurance renewal so that you're prepared. And if that's also around HR, around all the other processes that you have as a general standard, Because, if you're a company over 25 people, you must have an HR department or a team part of your management team. And if you're a certain company size, you even need to have more resources. So being able to implement that into your business, either internally or externally with your IT advisor, I think is critical at least once a year, if not quarterly, depending on again how big your business is. But I fully agree with you there. I think there's a lot of misconceptions and assumptions that because it's in the cloud, it's secure, or it's in the cloud and it's backed up. Those are very poor misconceptions that I can tell you right now. The companies, if you read their end user license agreements and short form EULAs that most people just accept without ever reading, you'd be very surprised in what they're responsible for and what they're not responsible for. And for the most part, they're very limited on responsibility to mitigate litigation and risk. So there's a lot more onus that the end user needs to be aware of. So I do thank you for that and for the clarity on that. So, Ibrahim, as final notes of this conversation, are there any sort of last minute, words of wisdom you want to share with us before we say thank you?
What I'd like to say is that I encourage all business leaders and entrepreneurs to always consider attending a mediation if they find themselves entangled in a dispute. And furthermore, I would highly encourage all entrepreneurs and business owners and leaders to really think about designing processes within their respective organizations wherein they can ensure that they have the right dispute avoidance mechanisms so that the organizations can continue to grow and prosper. Thank you so much, Erez. It's been a pleasure.
Ibrahim, thank you so much for being on our podcast. Again, everybody out there who's listening, Ibrahim Hussain from Sula Solutions, Toronto based mediator and arbitrator. Thank you again for being on our show. It was a real pleasure. And thank you, everybody, for listening. Please like and follow so that you'll be notified of our next podcast. Looking forward to seeing you again back sometime soon. Have a great day.
You too, sir. Thank you. Bye.